The boy was blue when I first held him. Not the blue of a bruise. Not the blue of cold fingers on a winter morning. This was something deeper, a color that lives just past the edge of living. I've seen it once before, on a man who drowned in the Platte and was pulled out too late. His lips had gone that same shade. A kind of quiet, like the body had already started making peace with what was coming. My son was 4 hours old and the world was done with him. I remember the weight of him in my hands. So light. The kind of light that frightens you, like holding a bird that stopped fighting. He wasn't crying. He should have been crying. I'd heard enough births in my years. Calves, foals, 2 of my brother's children, out on the open plains. And the sound of new life is never silence. Silence is the thing that splits you open. The storm had come fast. The way they do in late October, when the Black Hills decide they're finished with autumn. We were 3 days out from winter camp, moving slow because Changtechilapi, my wife, my loved heart, the woman who'd carried this child 11 months against the weight of everything. She'd been laboring since the morning before. The other women were with her, in the shelter we'd made from the wagon's canvas and 2 cottonwood poles, and I stood outside in the wind and listened to sounds I'd never heard her make. Not in 12 years. Then the sounds stopped. My mother-in-law came out first. She was a woman who'd survived 4 winters of starvation and never once showed you the inside of her fear. When she looked at me, her face was something I'd never seen on it before. She said, "The baby came, but Changtechilapi is gone." I'm not going to talk about that part at length. I'll tell you only this. There are losses that break you clean, like a bone, where you know the shape of the break. And there are losses that take something from inside you. So quietly you don't notice they've taken it until, months later, when you reach for it and find only air. That's the kind this was. I stood there in the snow, in the dark, with the wind cutting down from the north, like it had an argument with me personally, and I understood, for the first time in my 42 years, that I did not know how to weep. My people have ways of grieving. There are songs, there are cuts, there is the 4-day sitting. But none of that was available to me on a hillside in the dark with a dying child. My mother-in-law put him in my arms and said, "He needs milk or he dies before morning." I looked at my son, blue, silent, small, impossibly fragile creature who was the last thing Changtechilapi had left in the world. Her nose, already. The particular set of her jaw. In 4 hours he'd already become his mother's face. I started walking. I want you to understand what the land looked like, so you know what I was moving through. The Black Hills in October at night, in a norther, is not a place that cares about you. The Ponderosa goes dark and shapeless, just masses of black against a sky that's the color of a tin plate. The ground is all dead grass and rock, and the snow the wind's throwing is the dry, stinging kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck, and reminds you at every step that thing on a permanent landscape. I had the boy inside my coat, my chest to his back. I could feel him breathing, barely, that faint pulse of warmth, and I thought, you keep breathing, you hear me. You keep breathing, and I will do the rest. I knew there was a homestead 7, maybe 8 miles east. I'd passed it 3 months prior when I was ranging, a small outfit, a woman working a claim alone. I hadn't gone close. I had reasons for keeping distance from white settlements then, reasons having mostly to do with the previous 2 years and a cavalry sergeant I never want to think about again. I knew the smoke line from the chimney. I knew the rough direction, and I had nothing else. My son breathed against my chest. Barely, but steady. I walked. The light from her window was the first thing I saw. Just a thread of it, orange, through a gap in the shutter. The kind of light that in any other moment of my life I'd have looked at from a distance and kept walking. A white woman's homestead, in the dead of night, a Lakota man at the door. I knew how that story read, and I knew how it usually ended. I knocked anyway. Nothing. I knocked again, and this time I said it in English, which I hadn't spoken since spring. I said, "I have a newborn child. I need help." Silence for a moment, then the shuffle of feet. Then a woman's voice, low and careful. "Who's there?" I told her my name. I told her my son was dying. I told her I needed milk, any milk, a cow, a goat, whatever she had, and I would pay her in silver or trade or whatever she asked. I said all of this fast without stopping, because I was afraid that if I stopped, she'd make up her mind before I got to the part that mattered. The door opened. Her name was Clara Brennan. She was. I'll say this plainly because it's the truth. Not what I expected. Not that I'd spent time building expectations. I had a dying child. She could have been anyone. But when the light from inside caught her, she was a woman, maybe 35, 36. Narja darklist around her shoulders the way it only gets when you've been woken from sleep, wearing a coat thrown over a nightdress and holding a rifle at a 45-degree angle that told me she knew exactly how to use it and was making a deliberate choice not to. She looked at me. Then she looked at the shape inside my coat. She said, "Bring him in, just that." No hesitation. No reading my face for intentions. No asking about my purpose on her land. She looked at the child and made her decision in 1 second and stepped back to let me through the door. I'll carry that my whole life. She had a Jersey cow. The cow was a temperamental animal named Francis, who did not appreciate being woken up and said so at some volume. Clara handled her with the particular firmness of a woman who's been doing all her own work for a long time and wasn't asking for an argument. We warmed the milk, a little, just off the boil in a tin cup. Clara found a piece of soft cloth, twisted the corner of it, dipped it in the warm milk, let it cool another moment on her wrist, testing it, the way a woman does when there's no one to tell her how, and then she put it to my son's lips. He didn't take it. I watched her face. She didn't flinch. She dipped the cloth again and tried a second time, moving it very gently against the corner of his mouth. And she started talking, not to me, to him, in a low, steady voice, telling him the milk was there, telling him to take it, telling him in simple, straightforward English that she needed him to work with her here. My son opened his mouth. "I've been a chief since I was 31. I've led men in 3 fights where the odds were entirely against us and come out the other side. I've stood in council with men twice my age and held my ground when it cost me. I have, in my life, not broken down in front of another person. I came very close in that moment." The color in his lips was different within the hour. Not all the way back, not pink and full. Something had shifted. A warmth in the skin around his eyes, a tension in his fingers that hadn't been there before. Clara kept at the cloth, patient as someone who has learned that patience is not a virtue but a tool, and I sat across from her on a 3-legged stool, with my elbows on my knees and watched. She didn't look at me much. She was focused on the work, but once, maybe the 3rd hour, she did glance up. And what was in her face wasn't pity, and it wasn't the particular careful blankness white people sometimes arrange when they're trying to be polite about their discomfort. She said, "He's fighting." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's your blood." I didn't say anything. But I held on to that. Morning came the way. Morning comes in the hills after a storm. Sudden bright, cold enough to sting. The world out clean and white and indifferent to what had happened in the dark. My son was crying. Clara looked up when she heard it. The first full cry, not weak, not the mewling of something uncertain about whether it wanted to be here, but a real sound, a furious "I am here" sound. And the expression on her face was something I didn't have a word for. Not in Lakota, not in English. Relief is too small, pride is too much. It was something between them that belongs to people who've sat through a long night and come out the other side holding something they weren't sure they could keep. She put him in my arms. She said, "You need to get him somewhere warm where there's a woman who can nurse him properly. This is short term. He needs real feeding, regular feeding, and I've got maybe another day of what he'll need, and then Francis is tapped." I looked at her. There was milk on her sleeve where the cloth had dripped. Her hair was still loose. Her eyes had the red at the edges that comes from not sleeping, and I could see, now in the daylight, that she'd been crying at some point in the night. Not while I was watching, but at some point, alone, maybe when she'd thought things were going the wrong way. Her face showed the track of it, slight, around the jaw. I said, "You have a husband?" She said, "I did." I said, "What happened?" She said, "Same thing that happens. Fever, 2 winters back." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "My wife died last night." She looked at me, not with sympathy exactly, with recognition. The particular look that one person gives another when they know the exact shape of something and there's nothing to add to it. She said, "I'm sorry." Said, "I know. I stayed 3 days. I know what you're thinking, and it wasn't like that. Not then. Then it was just practical. The boy needed feeding. I needed to get word back to my people. And the storm had dropped 3 feet of snow on the hills and closed the passes east. So I stayed, and Clara fed my son, and I split her woodpile and mended the corner of her roof where a branch had come down in the wind. And we found out, slowly, you find out when you're stuck with someone in a small space for 3 days, with nothing between you and the weather, but a few inches of timber. I found out was this. She was from Pennsylvania. She'd come west with her husband Thomas, who was a man she described with the precise economy of someone who'd had a long time to understand a complicated thing. She said he was not a bad man, just a man who thought the frontier was a place to start over when actually it's a place that shows you exactly who you already are. She'd stayed because she'd buried him on the property, and she didn't see why she should have to leave her own land because he'd turned out to be wrong about himself. She had 30 head of cattle, a kitchen garden, and a creek that ran year-round. She had no neighbors within 12 miles, and she wasn't sure she minded. I told her about Chungtechilapi. Not everything, but some. The kind of telling that happens when you're not looking at the other person. When you're both looking at the fire, or looking at the child, and the words come out sideways. She didn't make the sounds people make when they're filling silence. She didn't say how terrible, how sad. She didn't offer anything hollow. She just listened, and sometimes nodded, and once she said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." And that was enough. That was exactly enough. More than most people had given me. On the third day, the snow was still deep but manageable, and I knew I needed to get back. My people would be worried. My mother-in-law would be holding things together, but she was old, and this had been a blow to her too, and I'd been gone 3 nights. I got ready to go in the morning. Clara had wrapped the boy. She'd made him a kind of sling from her own blanket. And she'd packed a skin of warm milk for the journey, and she'd tucked a piece of soft cloth inside the wrap because she said you'd need to feed him as you go. Every hour or so, stop and do what I showed you. I stood at the door with my son in his sling. I said, "How do I repay you?" She said, "You don't. There's no accounting for that kind of thing." I said, I want to bring you something. When the pass is clear, I want to come back." She looked at me for a moment. Not measuring, not guarded, just looking. "The way you look at something you're trying to decide how honest to be about," she said. "I won't say no to that. I came back in the spring. I brought horses, 3 of them, good horses, not traded off stock but from my own herd, and dried elk meat and pemmican and a blanket my mother had made that took her 4 months of winter. My mother-in-law made me take the blanket," she said. "You come to a woman's door again. You don't come empty." My son was 7 months old by then. He'd grown into himself. He had Chungtechilapi's jawline and her way of watching everything with those dark, serious eyes. And he had something of his own too. A kind of stubbornness in the set of his mouth that I was choosing to believe was mine. Clara came out onto the porch when she heard the horses. She looked different in spring. Or maybe I was looking at her differently. She'd tied her hair back, and there was dirt on her hands from the kitchen garden. And she had that particular look of a person interrupted in the middle of a job they care about. And she stood on the porch and looked at us coming up the track. And then she put her hand over her eyes against the sun and smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was not the smile you give visitors. It was the smile that escapes before you've decided to smile. the kind that tells the truth about what's underneath. I got down from my horse. She came off the porch, and she walked straight to me, and she looked at the boy in his sling, and she put her hand against his cheek, just for a moment, very gently, and she said, "You got big." He grabbed her finger. She looked up at me, and there were tears in her eyes, and she was annoyed about them. I could tell from the way she pressed her lips together. "Not sad tears, the other kind," she said. "I thought about him all winter. Didn't let myself worry too much, but I thought about him." I said, "He's well," she said. "I can see that." We stood there for a moment with the spring sun up on us and the smell of the earth coming up, and the sound of my horses shifting in the grass, and I thought, here is a woman who sat through a night next to a dying child, who was not her blood, and not her kind, and not her obligation, and she held the line because it was the right thing to do, and she asked for nothing, and she's standing here in her garden, not knowing what to do with her own feelings about it. I thought, perked. I have been alone for 7 months, and this is the first time since the storm that I've felt the shape of where something should be. I came back in summer. I brought 2 of my men with me that time, not as an escort, just because I didn't want the ride to be as long as it sounds, and they made camp at the creek, and I went to the house. Clara had a neighbor woman over from the South Claim, and she introduced me without ceremony, just said, "This is Iron Knife," and we had coffee, which I hadn't had since before the previous winter, and the neighbor woman was clearly storing up things to say to other people. But Clara paid it no mind. We talked for 3 hours. Longer than we'd talked total in those first 3 days, because then we'd been in the immediate of things, and now we were just 2 people with the ordinary luxury of time. I found out she'd read every book she'd brought from Pennsylvania twice through, and she had opinions on all of them. I found out she'd been teaching herself to speak Sioux from a trader's vocabulary book she'd ordered from a man in Rapid City, and that the book was extremely bad, which she'd worked out when the first word she tried on me made me look at her with a very specific expression, and she said, "Is that not right?" And I said, "It is a word, but not the word you wanted." And she said, "What does it mean?" And I told her, and she put the book in the stove. I brought her a better vocabulary. One of my men made it, a real one, with the sounds correct. She thanked him in Lakota, carefully looking at the page, and he looked at me, and then looked at the sky and tried not to show that he was moved by summer visits. That's how I would describe it. I was there every 6 weeks or so, and I'll tell you plainly, I was not unaware of what was building. I'd been a man in the world long enough to know the difference between courtesy and something else. I had Chungte Chilapi still sitting deep in me the way a serious thing does. Not a grief you're done with in a season. And I was not in a hurry. Some things you don't push. Clara wasn't pushing either. She was a woman who'd built her whole life in the years after her husband by her own will, put in her own hands. And she wasn't the kind who mistakes attention for intention. She was patient, in the way of people who've learned to be patient. Because impatience costs too much out here. But I'll tell you about a day in late August. I'd ridden over alone, and we were working on the fence line on the north side of her property where the wire had come down. Working, not talking, just side by side with the pliers and the post driver in the sun. And she said, without preamble, "How long were you and your wife together?" I said, 12 years, she said. "Were you happy?" I thought about that. I said, "We were." It was the kind of happiness that becomes ordinary because it's so steady. You don't notice it the way you notice the other kind. You only notice it when it stops, she said. Thomas and I had 6 years, and they were none of them easy, I said. But you stayed, she said. I did. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I'm stubborn and I believe you finish what you start. And because there were good months. And because I thought, if I left, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd given up too soon." I said, "Do you still wonder that?" She looked at the fence post. She said, "No, we kept working. The sun was going down behind the ridge to the west. My son, who was old enough to sit up by then, and was strapped to my back in his carrier, was watching. A hawk quarter the field with the single-minded focus of a child who has not yet learned that not everything he watches will stay. Clara glanced at him over my shoulder. She made a sound, half a breath, half a laugh, and said, "He's growing up fast." I said, "They do," she said. "What will you call him?" "You haven't told me," I said. "I've been thinking about it. For the Lakota ceremony, he has a name that is private. For the everyday name, the name people use." "I've been thinking," she said. "What have you been thinking?" I said. "Chong Tichilapi told me once, in the last months, that if it was a boy, she wanted a name that meant something about being found. She said, and she smiled when she said it. She had a particular way of smiling. When she thought she was being funny, she said she wanted him to have a name that meant he would never be lost." Clara was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a good name to look for," I said. "I was thinking of Hoxila Ikshe, the ordinary boy, because extraordinary things come from ordinary boys, and I want him to walk light," she said very quietly. "That's beautiful," I said. "You gave him the first thing. In that night, the milk, the warmth, the first hour of his life that worked. I think of that." She didn't answer right away. When she did, she turned toward me a little and said, "I think of that night too. More than you probably know." I said, "I know." She looked up, I said. "I can tell when you hold him. You don't hold him like a child you happened to help once. You hold him like someone you've been waiting to see." She said, That's a very direct thing to say." I said, "I'm a direct man. It took me until 42 to fully appreciate that. But I've arrived at it." She smiled at that. Again the smile that didn't ask permission, the one that told the truth. And she shook her head a little, and she turned back to the fence, and we worked in silence the rest of the hour. She was different after that. We both were. Autumn came back around. I want to tell you the shape of that year, what it looked like from the outside, before I tell you what happened in November, because you need to understand what the territory is before you understand what crossing it costs. The year was 1877. I'll leave out the name of my band, the agency, the treaty specifics. Those are things that belong to a longer and harder story, and this isn't that story. But I'll tell you that 1877 was not a year that was easy to be Lakota. There were men in Washington making decisions about land that was not theirs to decide about, and there were men at the agencies who had been given too much authority over people they didn't understand. And there was a particular captain at the closest fort who had decided that I specifically was a problem because I had not signed what I was asked to sign, and I was not planning to. This is important because in October, 3 of that captain's men rode onto Clara's land. I found out afterward, Clara, what they wanted. They wanted to know if she'd had contact with me. They'd gotten word from somewhere, the neighbor woman, probably, though Clara confirmed that, and I never asked, that a Lakota chief had been visiting the property through the summer. Clara told me what she said to them, and she told it to me without drama, in a flat voice, the way you tell someone about an ordinary event. She said she told them she had a hired man who was Lakota, and he helped with fence and stock. She said it simply, without elaborating, without any tells. She said, when they pushed on it, she said, "Are you calling me a liar?" And they'd back down. I listened to all of this. Then I said, "You know that puts you in an uncomfortable position with the captain." She said, "I don't care about the captain's opinion of my position." I said, "Clara, this is not a small thing. He has the authority to make things difficult for you in ways that," she said, "I know exactly what he has the authority to do. I've been managing the opinions of men with authority over my situation my entire adult life. I'm not unacquainted with the work." I looked at her. She said, "They came to my door looking for a way to use me against you. I didn't give it to them. That's all there is to say about that," I said. "Why?" she said. "Because I know who you are. Because I've spent a year watching how you move through the world. And I know what kind of man you are. And because nobody gets to use my land and my name and my word against a man I respect. The word respect." She said it plainly, the way she said most things without ornamentation. But I heard what it held. I heard the whole year in it, I said. Clara, she said. Don't make it into a moment if you can avoid it, I said. I can't. She looked at me, steady, both hands still around the tin cup of coffee she'd been holding. Her jaw set the way I'd come to know. It was set when she'd made up her mind about something and she was waiting to see what direction things would move. I said. I came here in a storm with a dying child, and you opened the door, she said. Any person would. I said they wouldn't. You know that, and I know that. She was quiet, I said. You've been a kind of anchor to us this whole year. The boy. You know what you are to the boy, and to me. I want you to know that I see it. I know what it has cost you. The captain and his questions and whatever your neighbor has been saying. And I know what it will keep costing. I'm not unaware. She set the coffee cup down, she said. I didn't do any of it because of what it cost, I said. I know. That's exactly why I need to say this. She waited. I said, I'm not a young man. I'm not a man who has easy things ahead of him. My people are in a hard time, and that is not going to resolve itself in a year. I carry a grief that I'm still working through. I have a son who needs more than I know how to give him. I'm bringing you difficulty, Clara. That's what I'm bringing. And I need you to know that I see that clearly, she said. Are you building up to asking me something? Or are you building up to talking yourself out of it? That stopped me, she said, because I've been watching you do this for 3 months, and I want to tell you that whatever you've decided about what I can and can't handle, you can set it down. I've told you before I know my own mind. I'll tell you again. Whatever you're about to say, you can say it. I said, I'm asking you to let me court you properly, in whatever way makes sense for two people in our particular situation, which I'll admit is unusual, but properly, honestly. I'm asking you to let me ask. She looked at me for a long moment. The fire was going in the stove. My son was asleep in the corner in his carrier. As he usually was by evening, the wind was up outside. That October sound, dry leaves against the siding, she said. Yes, just that. No qualifications, no conditions, no we'll see. Yes. And then she said, I was starting to wonder if you were going to make me do it. We didn't marry in the winter. It wasn't the season for it. And there were things to be done first. Conversations with my mother-in-law, opinion mattered to me and who surprised me. Conversations with my people, whose reactions were more various. And a long, careful period of Clara making sure she understood what she was choosing, and I making sure I understood what I was offering. My mother-in-law said to me in spring after she met Clara, she has a good face. She said it in Lakota, in the way that means something particular. Not just the features, but the character that looks out through it, she said. Chongte Chalapi would not be angry, she said. Chongte Chalapi would say, you are a slow learner, but you got there, I said. She would say exactly that. My mother-in-law laughed. The first real laugh from her since October of the year before. I kept that sound. What I want to tell you about, the moment I keep coming back to, the one that stays, is not the marriage itself, though I could tell you about that too. It's a smaller moment, and it happened in late spring, 6 weeks before. Claire and I were sitting on the porch steps in the late afternoon, and the boy was on his feet by then, which was still new, taking his wide-legged, uncertain steps across the yard with the focus of someone who has recently discovered that the ground is an opinion, rather than a fact. He'd fall and get up and fall again and get up again, and he'd stopped being alarmed by the falling. Seemed to me to indicate the beginning of character. Clara was watching him. She had her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and the sun was low and in her hair, and she was watching my son learn to walk with this look on her face that I didn't need to ask about. I knew it. I'd known it since October of the year before, the first morning when I'd seen it in the lamplight. It was the look of a woman who loves a child that is not hers, and has made peace with not needing the distinction to matter. Boy fell into the dirt again, sat for a moment with the stunned air of the recently horizontal, and then turned around and looked at Clara. He said, this was one of his first words. He'd been gathering them slowly, in no hurry, just like his father. He said, in his uncertain way, Lakota word for mother that children use. Ina. Not looking at me, not looking at the sky. Looking at Clara, she went very still. She looked at me. I could see her trying to decide whether to correct him, whether to explain something that a 14-month-old child has no framework for explaining, whether this was something that needed to be carefully managed. I said, "Let him call you what he knows." She looked at me. She had gone slightly pale in the way she went slightly pale when something hit her harder than she'd prepared for. And her jaw had done that thing, and she was making a deliberate choice about whether to let her face show what was happening in it. She said, "You sure?" I said, "Changte Chilapi is his mother, and she always will be. He will know her. We will make sure of it. But you were the first hands that kept him here. You were his first morning. He's not wrong to call you what he calls you. He's just very accurate." She turned away then, toward the yard, toward my son, who'd gotten himself back onto his feet and was setting off in a new direction with renewed determination. I could see from her profile what was on her face, not a complicated thing. Just the open, unguarded expression of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been told they're allowed to set it down. After a moment, she reached over without looking at me and took my hand. Just took it. Held it. Said nothing. Shh. We sat there on the porch steps with the sun going down and my son making his rounds of the yard and the evening coming in cool and clean off the hills and her hand in mine. That's what I keep. Not the big moments. Not the storm. Not the night in the lamplight. Not the proposal on the kitchen floor. This. Her hand in mine on the porch steps and my son in the yard and the evening coming. This is what 42 years of hard living was leading to, though I wouldn't have told you so at the time. I'll tell you now. Grew up knowing both his mothers, the one who gave him his face, and the one who gave him his first morning. He grew up knowing both languages, and he grew up on land that was partly his father's people's land, and partly his stepmother's deed, and that tension was never simple, and was never resolved in a clean way, because clean resolutions are for other kinds of stories. But he grew up, and his father, that broken, grieving man who walked 8 miles in a storm with a dying child against his chest, that man woke up most mornings, next to who'd opened her door when everything in her world said not to. A woman who'd called him an ordinary man, and meant it as the highest thing. He woke up most mornings, and he was enough. He was exactly enough. Steps were still there. Last checked. The hills don't care about any of it, the way hills don't. But the steps were there,